Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Easy English Spark channel. I'm so thrilled to have you here today. I hope you're all doing great and ready to jump into something truly exciting. Just like the journey we took through the chapters of our story, where we faced challenges, made choices, and kept pushing through to the finish line, today, we're going to light up your English listening and speaking skills. We'll guide you step by step to help you build your confidence and speak more fluently than ever before, just like unlocking the next level of a thrilling adventure. So, let's get started and spark up your English journey, because with every lesson, you're one step closer to mastering it, just like the characters chasing their goal. Chapter 1. The Burden of Silence. It's been almost 2 years now. 2 long, silent years since that fateful day. And yet, even as I stand here, speaking to you, I feel the weight of those memories pressing on me. Memories that I've kept buried for so long. But today, I've come to realize something crucial. It's time to break the silence, not for my own peace of mind, but because it's the right thing to do. Not just for me, but for the world that's still unaware of the truth. The truth that I have carried with me all this time. A truth that only I can share. It wasn't something I ever intended to speak of. Trust me, if I had my way, I'd still keep these events locked away, hidden from sight. But the burden of silence has become too great. You see, almost 2 years ago, something happened that shook me to my core. Something that has never left my mind since that day. There's a man, a colonel, to be precise. Colonel Blackwood, a name that I'm sure many of you have heard whispered, in dark corners, always associated with shadows, with deceit, and with something far darker. He is the brother of the infamous Professor Elias Blackwood, a man whose name sends chills down the spine of anyone in this city who has dared cross him. You may not know much about him, but I assure you, you will soon. And it's because of him that I stand before you now, sharing this story, unearthing truths that should never have remained hidden. Colonel Blackwood is responsible for spreading the lies, the rumors, vicious, damaging rumors about my dear friend Edmund Halloway. You see, it was Edmund, my closest friend and confidant, who became the target of these lies. For the sake of his reputation, for the sake of the man he was, and for the good of all who relied on him, I must speak out. I will not repeat the lies Blackwood spread. I won't dignify them with any more attention. But I will tell you what happened, what led to it all, what happened to Edmund, and why the world needs to know the truth. I am the only person alive who knows what transpired between Edmund Halloway and Elias Blackwood. I alone was there to witness the unraveling of events that would change everything. And I've come to realize that, perhaps, it's my responsibility to tell you. After all, I owe it to Edmund, to the truth, and to anyone who still believes that some secrets are best left untouched. It was a time of deep silence in Edmund's life, a time when he withdrew from the world. The city of London, the people we knew, the lives we lived, it all seemed to slip away from him. For many months, Edmund spent more and more time alone, distant, almost unreachable. His investigations, the cases he was working on, were consuming him. And yet, he said nothing, not a word of what was truly happening. He would come and go, always with a new mystery, a new danger at his heels. But I never questioned him. Not then. How could I? You see, Edmund had always been different. Brilliant, yes, but distant. A mind that never seemed to rest, always thinking, always solving. But something had changed. His isolation was no longer just a personal choice. It was part of something bigger, something I couldn't understand, something that, in the end, became far too dangerous for either of us to ignore. It was in the final year of our meetings that I began to sense the shift. At first, it was subtle, just a lingering unease in his eyes, a coldness in his tone. But then it became clear. The man I had known, the friend I had trusted, was slipping away, not because he had chosen to, but because he was forced to. Something was chasing him, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up. I remember the day he wrote to me from France, his letter arriving when I least expected it. I had been growing more and more concerned about his strange behavior, but the letter he sent was so cryptic, so detached, it only deepened the mystery. "Dear Watson," it began, "I hope this finds you well. I am working in France on an important matter, one that will take many months to resolve. The weather is tolerable here, though the food leaves much to be desired. I trust all is well at the surgery. I will write again soon. Yours, Edmund Halloway." And just like that, the silence returned. No explanation, no answers. Only a letter, a few lines of text, and a promise to write again. But as always with Edmund, his promises were never as simple as they seemed. A month passed. I kept myself busy as best I could with my own work, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. I kept wondering, kept asking myself, why hadn't Edmund written again? Why had he not shared anything of what he was working on? What was happening? My concern grew daily, until one day, as if summoned by the very thoughts I had been harboring, he appeared, just as suddenly as he had disappeared. I can't explain the shock I felt when he stood there, at the window of my surgery, looking pale, drawn, as though he hadn't slept in days. It wasn't just his appearance that stunned me. It was the sheer urgency that emanated from him. He didn't speak at first, just stared at me through the glass, his eyes filled with a worry I had never seen before. And then, without warning, he entered through the side door, as though he had been waiting for an opportunity to appear. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his voice cracking. "I look dreadful." What happened next is a blur of confusion and fear. Edmund didn't explain much at first. He wasn't one for long explanations after all. But what he said, and the way he acted, made it clear. Something was terribly wrong. He was being hunted, stalked, and he couldn't escape it. Not even in the solitude of his own mind. So here I stand, 2 years later, burdened by this story that I've kept locked inside for far too long. But I will not carry it alone anymore. It's time to speak the truth. It's time for the world to know what happened to Edmund Halloway, and why the silence, the fear, and the lies must finally be shattered. That, my friends, is the beginning of the story that has haunted me for so long. The beginning of a journey that would take us both to the very edge of life and death itself. And it's a journey I'm finally ready to share with you. Chapter 2: A Shadowed Reputation. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating as Edmund spoke, his words slowly unraveling the mystery that had consumed his life in the months prior. He was no longer the composed, logical man I had always known. There was an edge to his voice, a tremor in his hands as he checked the windows for the umpteenth time. It was as if the very walls around us had ears, as if the darkness outside held more than just the silence of the night. It was the silence of something far worse, something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The moment Edmund entered my surgery that night, I knew I was no longer dealing with the man I had once called a friend. Something had changed, and it wasn't just his physical appearance. His once sharp and confident demeanor had given way to an almost frantic urgency. He moved with purpose, but it was a purpose driven by fear. Fear of what, though? That was the question that haunted me as I watched him pace across the room, checking every door and window, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. It was clear that his enemies had closed in, and he was desperate to keep them at bay. But it wasn't just fear that had transformed him. No, there was more. Something darker, something more insidious had been lurking in the shadows of his mind. And as I sat there listening to him speak, I began to piece together the fragments of a story that stretched far beyond the case he had been working on, a story that was now far too dangerous for either of us to ignore. "You still don't understand, do you?" Edmund asked, his voice low and strained. "You think this is just another case, another criminal to be caught, another puzzle to be solved. But it's not. It never was." He paused, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since he'd entered. "This is different, Watson. This man, this monster is not just a criminal. He is the shadow behind every crime in this city. Every dark corner, every whispered rumor, every hidden plot, it all leads back to him." I blinked, the weight of his words sinking in. I had always known Edmund to be a man of logic, of reason. He had an unshakable faith in the law, in the system, in the idea that if you followed the clues, you could always uncover the truth. But now there was none of that certainty. Instead, there was fear, a fear that came not from a lack of evidence but from the sheer power of the enemy he was up against. This man, this monster, as Edmund called him, was not just a rogue criminal. No, he was something far more dangerous, a mastermind. A puppet master pulling the strings from behind the scenes, controlling everything and everyone in his orbit. His name was Elias Blackwood, a name that for many was just a rumor, a whisper in the dark. But for Edmund, Blackwood was all too real. And he was the very reason for the unraveling of Edmund's once tranquil life. I had heard the name Blackwood before, of course. It was a name that echoed through the criminal underworld, spoken in hushed tones as if to say it out loud would summon him from the depths of the shadows. Blackwood's reputation preceded him. But it was a reputation built on rumors and half-truths. Some said he was a ghost, a figure who never appeared in the light, always hiding in the darkness. Others claimed he was untouchable, that he had eyes and ears everywhere, that he controlled the city with an iron grip, never allowing anyone to challenge his authority. But now, as Edmund spoke, I realized just how far-reaching Blackwood's influence truly was. He wasn't just a criminal. He was the architect of every major crime in the city. His reach was so vast, so pervasive, that no one, not even the most brilliant minds, had been able to trace him back to his source. Every crime, every murder, every theft, it was all part of a grand design, a web woven so intricately that it was impossible to untangle. Edmund's words echoed in my mind as I tried to process what he had just told me. "He controls everything," he said. "Every gang, every corrupt official, every shady deal, it all traces back to him. And no one knows who he is, not really. He's a ghost, a shadow in the night. But I know who he is, Watson. I've seen the evidence. I've followed the trail and it leads straight to him." I could see the intensity in Edmund's eyes, the fire that had once burned brightly within him, now dimmed by the weight of his pursuit. The pursuit of Blackwood had consumed him, body and soul. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It had become personal. And that, more than anything, frightened me. "But why haven't you gone to the authorities?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. If you know who he is, if you have the evidence, why not go to Scotland Yard? Why risk everything? Edmund's gaze flickered to the floor, and for a moment, I thought he might not answer. But then, with a deep sigh, he looked up, his expression hardening. Because, Watson, there is no one who can touch him, he replied, his voice heavy with the truth. Not the police, not Scotland Yard, not even the most powerful men in the country. Blackwood is too clever, too well connected. He has people everywhere. He owns everyone, every policeman, every judge, every politician. Even if I handed them the evidence on a silver platter, it wouldn't matter. He has too many resources, too many loyal followers. He's untouchable. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I had always believed in the power of justice, in the idea that the truth would eventually come to light. But now, standing before me, was a man who had uncovered the truth and realized that it was a truth too dangerous to expose. Edmund had discovered the horrifying reality. Some truths were better left buried, but Edmund wasn't one to give up. He couldn't, not when it came to something as important as this. He was too driven, too obsessed with uncovering the darkness that had taken root in this city. And now, it seemed that the shadows had taken hold of him, too. As he spoke, I began to understand just how deep this rabbit hole went. Edmund had been hunting Blackwood for months, following the crumbs of a trail that led him to the heart of London's criminal underworld. But with each step he took, the danger grew, and so did the weight of the secret he carried. It was a secret that had consumed him, that had turned his once calm and steady demeanor into one of paranoia and fear. The truth, Watson, Edmund continued, his voice growing softer, is that we're both caught in the web now. There's no way out. Blackwood's reach is too wide. He knows everything. He's always watching. And if we don't stop him, if we don't end this now, it will be too late for all of us. I could see it in his eyes, the fear, the determination, the sheer resolve that had taken over him. And in that moment, I knew that Edmund wasn't just warning me. He was asking for my help. He needed me, not just as a friend, but as an ally in this war against a shadow that had taken over the city. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. The story that Edmund had just revealed to me was only the beginning. And as much as I wanted to turn away, to walk away from the nightmare he had uncovered, I knew I couldn't. I had already stepped into the darkness with him, and now there was no turning back. Chapter 3. The Unexpected Visit. The days after Edmund's arrival were nothing short of strange. I had always known him to be a man of routine, meticulous in his actions, and careful in his mannerisms. But now, something had shifted within him, The letter from France, cryptic and distant as it was, had left me with more questions than answers. Why had he been so vague about his work there? What had really happened to him during those months? And more importantly, why had he suddenly shown up at my door, pale and anxious, as if he had been running from something he couldn't escape? I tried to carry on with my usual tasks, attempting to maintain some semblance of normality. The surgery, the patients, the endless hours of work, it was all I could do to distract myself from the gnawing worry that had taken root in my mind. But that worry only deepened when, just 1 month later, I saw him again, standing outside the window of my office. It was an unseasonably cold evening for spring, the wind biting at my skin as I watched Edmund through the glass. His form was barely illuminated by the dim light outside, but there was something unsettling in the way he stood there, motionless, like a figure caught between two worlds. It was the kind of look I had seen in his eyes before, back when he had been on the brink of unraveling something too dangerous to speak of. But this time, there was no excitement, no fire in his eyes. There was only a grim certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. I didn't hesitate. I opened the door, stepping out into the cool evening air to greet him. But before I could say a word, Edmund was already speaking, his voice strained and hoarse. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his gaze fixed on the ground, avoiding mine. I looked dreadful. There was no time for pleasantries. No room for the usual banter we shared. The urgency in his voice, the way his body trembled with an unseen fear, told me all I needed to know. Something had happened, something catastrophic, and I was about to be dragged into it. I stepped back, motioning for him to come inside. "Edmund, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Without answering, he walked past me, entering my office with the kind of determined pace that only a man with nowhere else to go can have. I closed the door behind him, locking it instinctively, though I didn't know why. There was no reason to suspect anything unusual at the time, but in the pit of my stomach, I could feel it, the same gut instinct that had always warned me of impending danger. As Edmund paced around the room, his eyes darting from one corner to the other, I noticed the blood on his hand. It wasn't much, just a smear of crimson near the palm, but it was enough to make my pulse quicken. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice trembling with concern. "I didn't come here for sympathy, Watson," he replied, not looking at me. He was busy checking the windows, ensuring that they were tightly shut, pulling the blinds down with swift, practiced movements. "I came here because I need you to listen, and I need you to understand. This is not a time for questions, not yet. There's no time for explanations, but you have to trust me." I watched him closely, my mind racing as I tried to process everything. The Edmund I knew would never have acted like this. He was always in control, always calm and collected, even in the most trying of circumstances. But now, he seemed like a man on the run, a man trying to outrun something he could never escape. And as I stood there, watching him check the locks one more time, I began to realize that whatever had brought him here was much worse than I had initially thought. He stopped for a moment, his eyes locking with mine. There was no disguising the fear in them now, no veil of bravado to hide what he was truly feeling. "I'm being hunted, Watson," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "And I don't know how long I can keep running." "Who's hunting you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the corner of the room, staring out of the window into the dark streets below. His silhouette was barely visible in the dim light, but his posture told me everything I needed to know. He was waiting for something, waiting for someone. His mind was not with me at that moment, but elsewhere, somewhere far more dangerous, far more uncertain than I could comprehend. "The man who is hunting me," Edmund said slowly, as if testing the words on his tongue, "is the same man I've been chasing for months. Elias Blackwood. He's more than just a criminal, Watson. He's a shadow, a master of manipulation, a puppet master, pulling the strings of every criminal organization in London." I stepped closer, my mind struggling to catch up with his words. "What are you talking about? Blackwood is just a name, a rumor, a ghost." Edmund shook his head, his expression darkening. "He's no ghost. He's real, and he's far more dangerous than you can imagine. He's everywhere, Watson. He's in the very walls of this city, and if I'm not careful, he'll tear it all down. I won't let that happen, but I need your help. I can't do this alone." I stood there, stunned by the weight of his revelation. Elias Blackwood was not a name I had heard in passing or read about in newspapers. No, Blackwood was a shadowy figure who existed only in whispers, talked about in hushed tones by the criminals who feared him. But now, Edmund was telling me that this man, this enigma, was real, and he was after Edmund. The realization sent a cold shiver down my spine. "I need to leave London," Edmund continued, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "But I can't do it alone. I need you with me, Watson. I need your help. You're the only one I trust." The words hung in the air between us. I could feel the weight of his request bearing down on me, the gravity of the situation pressing on my chest. Edmund had never asked for help before, not like this. Whatever had happened in France, whatever danger he had uncovered, it was clear that he was in deeper than either of us could have anticipated. and now it seemed I was caught up in it too. "But where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "To Europe," Edmund replied, his eyes dark and distant. "We have to get out of the country. I don't know where we're going yet, but I'll figure it out along the way. You'll come with me, Watson. There's no other choice." The decision, though it was not mine to make alone, was made in that instant. Whatever awaited us on the other side of the sea, whatever secrets lay ahead in the unknown, I knew one thing for sure. I was in this now. And once you stepped into Edmund Halloway's world, there was no turning back. Chapter 4: A Dangerous Game. The night was thick with tension, the kind of tension that wraps itself around your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The moment Edmund had stepped into my surgery and shared his cryptic warning, the world as I knew it had begun to change. The calm, predictable life I had led as a doctor, an orderly life that seemed immune to the chaos of the outside world, was now entangled in a web of shadows and lies. The gravity of Edmund's words was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just running from some common criminal. He was being hunted by a mastermind, someone whose influence reached into every corner of London, and perhaps beyond. As Edmund moved through the room, checking locks, adjusting curtains, and pulling the blinds down tightly, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in the eye of a storm. The air seemed thick with unease, every movement Edmund made carrying an underlying urgency. I watched him, wondering just how deep the rabbit hole really went. The blood on his hand, though minor, had only added to the chilling picture. It was strange, the way he had simply brushed it off. But then again, nothing seemed to rattle him. Not even the fact that his life had been turned upside down by a figure so elusive, so dangerous, that no one even knew what he truly looked like. Elias Blackwood was a name known in whispers, in dark alleys, where the desperate spoke of him in hushed tones. And yet it was Edmund, my friend, who had managed to uncover the truth. And now it was clear that Blackwood was coming for him. And for me, "I'm sorry for dragging you into this, Watson," Edmund said, finally breaking the silence that had stretched between us like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He stopped pacing and turned to face me. "But I need you to understand something. This isn't just about me anymore. This is bigger than both of us." "Then tell me," I replied, my voice steady despite the growing sense of dread inside me. "What is it about Blackwood that's so dangerous? You keep saying he's more than just a criminal, more than a mastermind, but I still don't understand why you're running, why you've come to me." Edmund let out a long, exhausted sigh and sat down heavily in the chair near the window, his fingers still lightly gripping the edges of the armrest, as though anchoring himself to something solid. For a moment he didn't speak, as if he was gathering his thoughts, or perhaps summoning the courage to say something that would only deepen the pit of fear in my stomach. Blackwood, Edmund finally began, his voice low but firm, isn't just controlling the streets of London. He controls the very institutions that are supposed to protect us. The police, the courts, even the government. And it's not just in London. His reach extends across Europe, and maybe even further. He's a genius, Watson. A mastermind, yes, but one who has built his empire from the ground up, not through force or violence alone, but by manipulating people into doing his bidding without them even knowing it. I felt my heart race at his words. What he was saying was incomprehensible, almost impossible to believe. How could one man, one criminal, have that much power? How could someone be so well hidden in plain sight that even the authorities, those meant to bring justice, were powerless against him? But how do you know all this? I asked, my curiosity piqued despite the mounting anxiety. How did you uncover it? Edmund didn't answer immediately. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together as if he were holding on to the last shred of sanity that remained in the face of everything he had learned. I've been tracking Blackwood for months, Watson. Piece by piece, I've followed the trail of his operations, of his influence. I've spent countless nights in dark corners of the city, watching, listening, piecing together the puzzle. It wasn't easy. Blackwood is careful, too careful. He makes sure no one gets close enough to truly see him. I could see the weariness in his eyes, the toll this obsession had taken on him. His once sharp and focused demeanor had been replaced by something I could only describe as haunted. The hunt for Blackwood had become his everything, consuming him, stripping him of the very essence of who he was. And now, standing here trying to explain it to me, I could tell that he was at the breaking point. I've seen things, Watson, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I've uncovered connections, deals, people who thought they were untouchable, all bowing to him. It's not just street thugs and petty criminals who work for him. It's the most powerful people in the city. Politicians, businessmen, even law enforcement. They're all in his pocket, all dancing to his tune. And I'm the only one who knows. The only one who's come close to unraveling his empire. I felt the weight of his words sink deep into my chest. He wasn't just in danger of losing his life. He was on the brink of discovering something so vast, so terrifying, that the entire structure of the city itself could come crashing down. Edmund had uncovered a truth so dark that even he couldn't fully comprehend it. And now Blackwood knows I'm close, Edmund continued, his voice thick with a mixture of anger and fear. I've made enemies, powerful enemies. And now he's coming for me. But it's not just me he's after, Watson. He's after you too. If you stay in London, if you continue to associate with me, you'll be dragged into this as well. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. I had never once imagined that my life would be caught in the crossfire of something like this. But now, as Edmund's words hung heavy in the air, I understood. I was already in too deep. There was no turning back. No matter how much I wanted to walk away, to pretend none of this had ever happened, I knew it was impossible. Edmund had already dragged me into this world, whether I liked it or not. So what now? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. What do we do? Edmund stood up abruptly, his face a mixture of determination and exhaustion. We play the game, Watson. A dangerous game, but one we can't afford to lose. Blackwood thinks he's untouchable. He thinks he can control everything. But he made a mistake when he crossed me. He turned and walked toward the door, pausing just before leaving. Pack your things. We're leaving London. We need to get out before it's too late. I knew in that moment that this wasn't just some simple matter of solving a case. It wasn't just a criminal to catch, a puzzle to solve. This was a fight for survival against a man who controlled everything from the shadows. A man who had manipulated the system for so long that it was almost impossible to tell where the law ended and where his power began. As I followed Edmund to the door, I couldn't help but wonder, would we make it out alive? Or would we too become pawns in a game we never agreed to play? Chapter 5. The Unseen Enemy. The hour was late when Edmund and I began preparing for our departure from London. The urgency in his movements, the restlessness that had taken over him in the last few days, made it clear that there was no time to waste. He had spoken in hushed tones about Blackwood's influence, and the implications of his words had settled into my mind like a creeping shadow. I could no longer deny the danger that hung over us. It was not merely the danger of a criminal mastermind pursuing us. It was the weight of a vast and invisible empire that stretched its tendrils into every facet of life, of society itself. I had always prided myself on my ability to remain calm under pressure. Years of medical practice had taught me how to handle emergencies, how to think clearly when chaos threatened to overwhelm me. But nothing in my experience could have prepared me for what Edmund had revealed. Nothing could have prepared me for the reality that we were about to step into a world where the rules of the game had been written by someone who was, for all intents and purposes, untouchable. As we packed our things, I couldn't help but watch Edmund closely. His once immaculate appearance had faded, replaced by an almost desperate urgency. He had always been a man who prided himself on his intellect, his composure. Yet now, as we moved through the small, cluttered space of my surgery, I saw only the man who had been consumed by the chase, whose obsession with Blackwood had become a consuming force, stripping him of the man he once was. "You still don't understand, Watson," he said, as though he could read the questions forming in my mind. "Blackwood isn't like any criminal we've ever encountered. He isn't some petty thief or murderer. He's a force of nature. He operates in the shadows, unseen by those who think they're looking. He's everywhere, and yet nowhere. You can't fight what you can't see." I nodded, though the weight of his words seemed to press down on me more with each passing second. "You've said it before. He controls everything. But how does he do it, Edmund? How does he stay hidden, stay untouchable?" Edmund paused, his fingers hovering over the suitcase in front of him. For a moment, he didn't speak, as though trying to gather his thoughts. "It's all about control, Watson. Blackwood doesn't operate like a typical criminal. He doesn't need to resort to violence or force. He's a puppet master. His influence is subtle, insidious. He uses people, manipulates them, and makes them believe they're acting of their own free will. He finds the cracks in the system, exploits them, and bends them to his will." I watched him closely as he spoke, a sense of awe mixed with disbelief settling in. "So, what you're saying is that Blackwood doesn't just have power over criminals. He has power over everyone, over society itself." Edmund met my gaze, his eyes hardening with a mixture of anger and determination. "Exactly. He controls not only the underworld, but also the political, legal, and financial systems. He has eyes in the highest places, Watson. Judges, politicians, businessmen, they're all under his thumb. And the worst part? They don't even know it. They think they're making decisions for themselves. They think they're in control. But in reality, Blackwood is pulling the strings." The enormity of what Edmund was saying sank in slowly, like the tide creeping in on the shore. It was one thing to hear rumors about a criminal mastermind operating in the shadows, but it was another thing entirely to hear it from someone who had come so close to uncovering the truth. Blackwood's empire wasn't built on brute force. It was built on manipulation, on bending people to his will without them even realizing it. And that made him far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. "So, where does this leave us, Edmund?" I asked, my voice quieter now, weighed down by the enormity of the situation. "If Blackwood is as powerful as you say he is, how can we stop him? How can we even fight against someone we can't even see?" Edmund's expression darkened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "That's the question, Watson. I've spent months gathering information, tracking his movements, uncovering his network. But I haven't been able to find him. Not really. Blackwood has no face, no name, no identity that anyone can pin down. He's a ghost, a phantom who operates from the shadows. He paused, and I could see the exhaustion on his face, the weight of the obsession that had driven him this far. I've come close, closer than anyone ever has. I've followed the trail, but every time I think I'm about to catch him, he slips through my fingers. He's always one step ahead. Always. I could hear the frustration in his voice, and for a moment, I found myself wondering if we were both chasing a myth. An enemy so elusive, so untouchable, that we were doomed from the start. But Edmund's eyes told me that he wasn't ready to give up, not yet. His determination was unshaken, even in the face of such overwhelming odds. "We have to keep moving," he said, suddenly resolute. "We can't afford to waste any more time. If Blackwood knows we're on to him, we'll never get another chance. We have to get out of London, go somewhere he won't expect us, where we can lay low and regroup." I nodded, though the sense of helplessness gnawed at me. We were about to leave behind everything we knew, stepping into the unknown, not even sure where we would go or what we would do once we got there. It was a terrifying thought, but it was also the only option we had. The truth was that we were already in too deep. Once you step into Blackwood's world, there is no turning back. Every move we made from this point forward would be a part of the dangerous game he had set in motion, and there was no telling what it would cost us in the end. As we finished packing, the weight of the situation seemed to press down on me even harder. We weren't just running from Blackwood. We were running from the unseen enemy who controlled everything, who controlled our every move without us even knowing it. And the worst part? We might never know where he was, when he was watching, or how far his reach truly extended. The only thing I knew for certain was that this was just the beginning. The real game was about to begin, and I could only hope that we were ready for what lay ahead. Chapter 6: The Deadly Encounter. The streets of London were eerily quiet as we prepared to leave. There was a strange sense of finality in the air, as though we were closing the door on a chapter of our lives that would never be reopened. We didn't speak much during the final preparations. Edmund moved with a sense of urgency, constantly checking the room for anything we might have missed, his sharp eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. I couldn't help but feel that we were being watched, even though there was no sign of anyone following us. Perhaps it was just the anxiety that had settled over me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closer than ever. As we stepped into the carriage that would take us out of the city, I glanced back at my surgery one last time. It had been my sanctuary, my safe place. Now it felt like a relic from a life that no longer belonged to me. I had crossed a threshold, one from which there would be no return. There was no going back to the calm, predictable existence I had once known. Edmund sat across from me in the carriage, his eyes fixed on the window, his mind far away. He hadn't spoken since we had left the safety of the surgery, and I knew, better than to ask him about the things weighing on his mind. He was a man consumed by his thoughts, and I understood that it was better to let him be. But there was something else gnawing at me. The question that had been left unanswered since. He first spoke of Blackwood. Why was Blackwood after him? What was it about Edmund that made him such a threat? And why had Blackwood's influence spread so far, with so many pawns unknowingly caught in his grip? The answers seemed to lie just beyond my grasp, always out of reach, just like the elusive figure of Blackwood himself. As the carriage made its way through the streets of London, I tried to focus on the path ahead. We were headed toward the docks where we would board a ship bound for Europe. The destination didn't matter. What mattered was getting away from Blackwood, putting some distance between us and the dangerous game that had already begun. But then, as we turned down a narrow street, a strange feeling crept up on me. It was the sensation of being watched again, only this time, it felt much more intense, more immediate. I looked over at Edmund, but he was still staring out the window, lost in his thoughts. I was about to dismiss the feeling as paranoia when suddenly the carriage lurched to a halt. "Wait here," Edmund said sharply, his voice cold and controlled. He didn't wait for a response. He jumped from the carriage and disappeared into the shadows of the alleyway. I watched him go, my heart racing with unease. The suddenness of his departure, the way he moved with such purpose, made it clear that something was wrong. I had never seen him like this, so focused, so determined. But this wasn't the Edmund I knew. This was a man on the edge, a man who had been pushed to his limits. I hesitated for only a moment before following him. My instincts told me to stay in the carriage, to remain safe. But something in my gut told me that if I didn't go, I might never see Edmund again. I stepped out of the carriage, my footsteps muffled by the cobblestone street. The night air was cold, and the shadows seemed to swallow everything around me. I tried to move quietly, staying close to the buildings, my eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. But the street was deserted, eerily so. The silence was suffocating. I rounded the corner, following Edmund's retreating figure, when I suddenly heard a voice, low and menacing, from behind me. "Well, well, well. What do we have here?" I froze, my blood running cold. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The voice was unmistakable, smooth and cold like the slither of a snake. It was a voice I had heard only in whispers, a name that had haunted the darkest corners of the city. "Elias Blackwood," I whispered under my breath. I felt a rush of adrenaline, but my body remained frozen in place. The man who had been pulling, The strings from the shadows, the puppet master whose name had become a legend, was now standing behind me, just out of sight. I had no idea how long he had been following us, or how long he had been watching us from the shadows. But I knew one thing for certain. We had stepped into the lion's den. "You're quite brave, Watson," Blackwood's voice continued, his tone dripping with amusement. "Or perhaps just foolish. Either way, you've made a grave mistake." I turned slowly, my eyes locking with his. Elias Blackwood stood there, tall and imposing, a figure who seemed to tower over the alleyway despite his casual stance. His eyes, dark as coal, gleamed with an unsettling calm, and his smile was cold and calculating. He was dressed immaculately, his tailored coat fitting him perfectly, as though he were nothing more than a man of high society, though everything about him screamed danger. "Where is he?" Blackwood asked, his gaze narrowing, as he searched the alley for Edmund. I said nothing, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was paralyzed by the overwhelming presence of this man. Blackwood had a way of commanding the space around him, of making you feel like there was no escape. It was as if he could see into your soul, as if he knew your every fear, your every hesitation. "You're quite loyal, I'll give you that," he continued, stepping closer, his shoes clicking sharply against the cobblestone. "But loyalty, Watson, can be a dangerous thing. Don't you see? Edmund is already lost. The game has already been decided." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure, but the fear was rising in me. "What do you want from us?" I managed to ask, though my voice barely carried in the cold air. Blackwood laughed softly, a low, dark chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. "What do I want?" he repeated, as if the question itself was laughable. "I want everything, Watson. Power, control, the city. But more than that, I want what Edmund has, what he's taken from me. And if you think for 1 second that you can stop me, you're mistaken." His words hung in the air, thick with threat. I could feel the tension building, the moment before everything would change. My mind raced, desperately trying to find a way out, but there was no escape. We were trapped. Suddenly, there was movement in the shadows, and I saw Edmund emerge, his figure cutting through the darkness like a shadow of his former self. He didn't look afraid, not at all. If anything, he seemed almost calm, as if he had been expecting this confrontation all along. "You're too late, Blackwood," Edmund said, his voice steady, despite the obvious danger. "You'll never win." Blackwood's eyes flashed with something akin to fury, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating smile. "We'll see about that." Without warning, Blackwood made his move, stepping forward with the kind of speed and precision that seemed almost unnatural. I braced myself, instinctively moving toward Edmund, But before I could react, Blackwood had already disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing in the middle of the alley, heart pounding, with only the echoes of his chilling words lingering in the air. It was the beginning of a game far more dangerous than I had ever anticipated, and now there was no turning back. Chapter 7. The Race Across Europe. The moments that followed Blackwood's encounter felt like an eternity. I could still hear his voice, that smooth, sinister tone echoing in my ears long after he had disappeared into the shadows. I had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. The alley had felt like the eye of a storm, a place where the dangerous forces at play were momentarily suspended, only to come crashing down on us once more. Edmund had been the one to pull us out of that situation, pushing us toward a swift departure. His usual calm demeanor had returned, but there was something in his eyes, something dark, that told me just how much the confrontation with Blackwood had rattled him. For the first time, I saw fear in Edmund's eyes. It wasn't the fear of a man who was simply worried about his life, but the fear of someone who understood the true depth of the monster we were dealing with. Blackwood was no longer just a figure lurking in the shadows. He had become an immediate, visible threat, and we were in his sights. We quickly boarded a carriage that would take us to the docks, but even in the relative safety of the carriage, the unease never left me. Every bump in the road, every shadow we passed, seemed like a harbinger of what was to come. It wasn't just London we were running from anymore. It was the entire network of Blackwood's influence, a web that seemed to stretch far beyond the city's borders. And now it seemed we were about to take the fight to Europe. Edmund, sitting across from me in the dimly lit carriage, was staring out the window. His brow was furrowed in thought, his jaw clenched tight. I knew he was calculating, as he always did, his mind working through the next steps in the plan. But I also knew that for all his intelligence, he had no clear idea of what Blackwood might do next. We were running on instinct now, each decision more critical than the last. "You know this won't be easy," Edmund said, finally breaking the silence, his voice a low murmur that matched the tension in the air. "We can't hide forever. Blackwood has resources. People everywhere. He knows we're leaving London, and if we're not careful, he'll be on us before we even reach the border." I nodded, my own thoughts spinning. "So, what's the plan? Where do we go from here?" Edmund turned to face me, his eyes sharp, though there was a trace of exhaustion behind them. "We head for Europe," he replied. "France at first. From there, we'll make our way across the continent. The further we get, the harder it will be for Blackwood to track us." "And after that?" I asked, my mind racing to catch up. "How do we even begin to fight back?" Edmund's gaze hardened, his voice taking on a steely edge. "We don't fight back yet. We survive. We gather more information. We find allies. Only then can we start to unravel Blackwood's network. But until then, we keep moving, stay ahead of him. And we have to stay out of sight. The weight of his words sank in. There was no grand plan to take down Blackwood just yet. We weren't warriors. We were fugitives on the run, trying to stay one step ahead of an enemy who was always watching. The enormity of the task before us settled over me like a heavy cloak, but I pushed the fear aside. We had no choice but to keep moving. The journey to the docks was quiet, filled with the rumble of the carriage wheels and the occasional hiss of the horse's breath. Every street we passed seemed to hold a threat, every passing figure a potential enemy. My mind kept returning to the question I had been too afraid to ask earlier. How far did Blackwood's reach extend? Was there anywhere safe for us? Was there any place we could hide? When we finally reached the docks, the sounds of bustling activity greeted us. Ships creaked against the wooden piers, their sails flapping in the wind as cargo was unloaded and loaded in preparation for the next journey. The air smelled of salt and oil, and the hustle of the port seemed to wash away some of the tension in my chest. But I knew it was only temporary. We weren't safe yet. Edmund led the way as we moved through the crowded docks, keeping his head down, blending in with the others who were preparing to board ships for destinations all over Europe. The urgency of the situation pressed against us, a silent weight that kept us moving quickly, without pause. We reached a small, inconspicuous ship, a merchant vessel bound for France. It was the perfect choice for our escape, low profile, unremarkable, and just the kind of ship that wouldn't attract attention. We weren't looking for comfort. We were looking for a way out, and this ship was our ticket to freedom. We boarded the vessel without incident, the crew too busy with their own tasks to pay much attention to us. As the ship began to pull away from the dock, the sight of London, receding into the distance, gave me a strange sense of relief. We were leaving behind the city, the danger, and, hopefully, Blackwood's ever-watchful eye. But even as the shoreline disappeared, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. We had only just begun this race across Europe, and I knew that Blackwood's reach was far greater than we had yet realized. For the next several days, the sea became our only refuge. The ship cut through the waves, the gentle rocking of the vessel offering a strange comfort. But Edmund was restless, unable to find peace even on the open water. His mind never stopped working. He spent hours poring over maps, plotting the course we would take once we reached France. I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease as we sailed deeper into unfamiliar waters. Every shadow on the horizon felt like a potential threat, every passing ship a possible pursuer. When we finally docked in France, we disembarked as quickly as we could, blending into the crowd of travelers. The port city we arrived in was bustling, full of life and movement, but the moment we set foot on land, the fear that had been building inside me surged again. We were in Europe now, yes, but Blackwood's influence could be just as strong here as it was in London. We need to move. Quickly, Edmund said, his voice tight with urgency. We can't linger. We've lost time already, and Blackwood is smart. If we're not careful, he'll track us here. I nodded, though my thoughts were racing. Where could we go now? Where was safe? The answer, as always, was nowhere. Blackwood's grip on the world was too strong, his network too vast. The only option left was to keep moving, to stay ahead of him, and to pray that we could find something, anything, that could give us an advantage. Over the next few days, we continued our journey across Europe, staying in small towns and quiet villages, careful not to draw attention to ourselves. We traveled by night when we could, and by day we kept to the back streets, avoiding main roads in busy areas. We were ghosts, moving through a world that was not our own, hunted by a man who knew no bounds. But as we traveled, I began to notice something strange. Edmund seemed to be growing more distant, more focused on something I couldn't understand. He spoke less, his thoughts consumed by whatever plan was forming in his mind. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, but there was something else there too. A spark of determination. He wasn't just running anymore. He was planning something. And I could feel it. Whatever we were running from, whatever Blackwood was throwing at us, Edmund was ready to face it head-on. One evening, as we sat in a small cafe in a quiet French village, Edmund turned to me, his eyes locked on mine with a new intensity. "We're close, Watson," he said, his voice steady. "We've made it this far, but the real work is about to begin. We'll find Blackwood's true weakness, and when we do, we'll strike." The words hung in the air between us, heavy, with promise. The race across Europe was far from over. But now, we had a new sense of purpose. We were no longer just running from Blackwood. We were moving toward him, ready to confront him and end this dangerous game once and for all. Chapter 8. The Trap at the Falls. The journey across Europe had been long, exhausting, and fraught with tension. Every stop, every town, felt like a temporary refuge from the shadows that hung over us. Edmund's mind was ever focused, always planning, always thinking 2 steps ahead. But even his sharp instincts couldn't protect us from the growing sense of danger that seemed to follow us no matter where we went. Blackwood's influence had proven more pervasive than we could have imagined. Even in these remote corners of Europe, we could feel his presence, lurking just beyond the periphery of our awareness, watching us. After several weeks of moving from town to town, We found ourselves in a small Swiss village, nestled in the mountains, far from the prying eyes of the world. It was a quiet, idyllic place, a place that seemed to offer the peace we so desperately needed. The air was crisp, the landscape beautiful, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel a sliver of hope. But Edmund's restlessness had only intensified. He had been quiet for days, his thoughts consumed by whatever plans were forming in his mind. He was searching for something that would finally give us an edge over Blackwood. It was in this quiet village that we first heard about the Reichenbach Falls. A local innkeeper, a man who had once worked in London, spoke of them with a kind of reverence. He described the falls as a breathtaking sight, the waters cascading down into a deep gorge, surrounded by lush forests and towering cliffs. "You must see it," he urged. "It is one of the most beautiful sights in Switzerland, especially at this time of year." Edmund had been listening intently, and I could see the spark of interest in his eyes. "How far is it?" he asked, his tone casual. But I could tell that his mind was already racing with possibilities. "It's not far," the innkeeper replied. "Just an hour's walk from here. You can't miss it." That was all it took. Without another word, Edmund stood up, already deep in thought. I had learned by now not to question his decisions, even if they seemed sudden or strange. But as we prepared to make our way to the falls, a sense of unease settled over me once more. Something in the back of my mind told me that this would not be the peaceful respite we had hoped for. The walk to the falls was as beautiful as the innkeeper had promised. The path wound through dense forests, with the sound of the water growing louder as we approached. The air was fresh, and the landscape was breathtaking. Yet, the further we walked, the more I could feel the weight of anticipation pressing down on me. It was as though we were walking toward something inevitable, something dangerous. When we finally reached the falls, the sight was even more awe-inspiring than I had imagined. The water thundered down from the cliffs, crashing into the chasm below with a roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath our feet. Mist rose from the falls, catching the sunlight in 1,000 tiny droplets, creating a shimmering, ethereal glow around the scene. But even as I stood there, mesmerized by the beauty of it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if the very landscape held its breath. And then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the cliffs, just beyond the mist, silhouetted against the crashing water. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Edmund?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Look." Edmund's eyes followed mine, and for the briefest moment, I saw a flicker of recognition in his gaze. But then his expression hardened. Without a word, he began to move, making his way toward the figure with the same determined, purposeful strides I had seen in him before. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming at me to stay back, but I followed him nonetheless, unable to resist the pull of whatever awaited us at the edge of the falls. As we approached the figure, it became clear who it was. The man stood with his back to us, watching the falls as though he were waiting for something or someone. The figure was tall, his posture erect, and though his face was hidden in shadow, I knew at once who it was. Professor Elias Blackwood, Edmund said, his voice sharp with both recognition and anger. I should have known you'd be here. The figure turned slowly, and there he was, Blackwood, his cold eyes gleaming with the same calculating malice that had haunted us for so long. His smile was thin, almost mocking, as if he had been waiting for this moment, savoring it. I must admit, Edmund, you've been more persistent than I expected, Blackwood said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. But you're too late. The game is over. I felt a chill run down my spine as Blackwood's words sank in. This was the moment we had been dreading, the confrontation that had been building up ever since we first heard his name. But something was wrong. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was a trap. Edmund's eyes flickered to the edge of the cliffs, and I followed his gaze. The rocky outcrop jutted out over the falls, and from where we stood, it seemed as though the drop was almost certain death. My stomach twisted as I realized the situation we were in. We had walked straight into Blackwood's plan, and now there was no way out. You've led me right to where I wanted you, Edmund, Blackwood continued, his voice growing colder. And now, you'll pay the price for your persistence. Before I could react, Blackwood made a subtle gesture, and suddenly, the ground beneath our feet seemed to shift. I heard a sharp noise behind me, and I spun around just in time to see two figures emerging from the mist. Two men, both armed, both moving with the precision of trained professionals. They were blocking our escape, and with each step they took, the reality of the situation became clearer. We've been waiting for you, Edmund, one of the men said, his voice rough. And now we're going to make sure you don't make it out alive. Blackwood's smile widened as he stepped closer to Edmund. You've been a thorn in my side for far too long. But now it ends here. You'll never threaten my empire again. In that moment, I knew what I had feared was true. We were caught, trapped at the edge of the Reichenbach Falls, surrounded by enemies, with nowhere to run. The vast chasm below seemed to call to us, the rushing waters ready to claim anyone who dared to fall. Edmund, however, was not the type to give in. Even now, with Blackwood's men closing in, he stood tall, his eyes fixed on Blackwood. You've underestimated me, as you always do, he said, his voice steady, though there was a glimmer of something dangerous in his gaze. "This isn't over, Blackwood. Not by a long shot." The tension between the two men was palpable, like the calm before a storm. The danger was inescapable, and yet there was something in Edmund's stance that told me he wasn't ready to surrender. This moment, the confrontation, the trap, was merely the beginning of a much larger battle. But as the men moved closer and the roar of the falls grew louder, I realized one thing. We had to make a choice. Would we fight, or would we fall into Blackwood's trap, just as he had planned? Chapter 9. The Final Battle. The roar of the Reichenbach Falls thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. The violent rush of water cascaded over the rocks, crashing into the chasm below, its power and fury a stark contrast to the tension in the air. Every movement felt amplified, as if the very world around us was holding its breath. We stood at the precipice of a final, irreversible confrontation, trapped at the edge of the falls, surrounded by Blackwood's men, and with no visible means of escape. I could feel the cold mist from the waterfall settling on my skin, making it difficult to see clearly, but my eyes were fixed on the man who stood before us, Elias Blackwood, the leader of this carefully crafted empire, the man who had orchestrated so much chaos from the shadows, was finally standing in front of us. And yet, there was something almost casual about him. He didn't seem like a man in a hurry, or one who felt threatened. No. Blackwood was the predator in this situation, and Edmund and I were the prey. Blackwood's cold smile never wavered as he surveyed us, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his well-tailored coat. "I must admit, Edmund," he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I didn't expect it to come to this. I thought, perhaps we could avoid this little disagreement. But here we are." Edmund stood tall, his eyes locked on Blackwood's. There was no fear in his gaze, only resolve. In that moment, I knew that he was prepared for whatever lay ahead, even if it meant risking his life to end this. "This ends now, Blackwood," Edmund said, his voice low but filled with determination. "You've manipulated too many, controlled too many lives, but you're not untouchable." Blackwood's smile widened. "Untouchable? Oh, Edmund, you really have no idea, do you? I've controlled everything around you for so long. You can't even begin to comprehend the scope of my reach. I've seen to it that no one could ever touch me. And now you've wandered too far into my territory." The two men who flanked Blackwood took a step forward, their eyes scanning us like hungry wolves circling their prey. Each man was armed with a weapon, an obvious move to show that there would be no negotiation, no chance for escape. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to remain calm, focusing on Edmund, who didn't flinch, didn't show a sign of fear. But then something unexpected happened. Edmund suddenly reached into his coat and pulled out a small silver case. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively took a step back. I had no idea what it was, but I knew whatever Edmund was about to do, it wasn't going to be ordinary. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he saw the case in Edmund's hand. "You think you can outsmart me, Edmund? You really believe you can still win?" "I don't need to outsmart you," Edmund replied, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "I just need to survive." Without another word, Edmund opened the case. Inside, a flash of something metallic caught the light. A small device, its purpose unclear. But I could see the glint in Edmund's eyes, and for a moment, I knew exactly what he was thinking. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a chance to turn the tide, to take the control back from Blackwood. Edmund pressed a button on the device, and in an instant, a loud mechanical click echoed through the air. The sound was jarring against the backdrop of the waterfall, but it was quickly followed by a soft hum. Suddenly, a small cloud of smoke puffed out from the device, and I realized what it was. A smoke bomb. Before Blackwood could react, Edmund threw the device onto the ground. The world around us was immediately shrouded in thick smoke, obscuring our vision and filling the air with a pungent, acrid scent. The noise of the falls, the murmurs of Blackwood's men, the subtle movements in the mist, everything became muffled. In the chaos, Edmund grabbed my arm and pulled me into the haze. "Stay close," Edmund hissed, his voice barely audible against the growing sound of the water. "We need to move quickly." I didn't have time to question him. I simply followed, my heart racing in my chest. The smoke was thick, suffocating, and it was nearly impossible to see anything more than a few feet ahead. But Edmund was certain. He knew where he was going. He had a plan, and I had learned by now that following him was the only choice we had. Through the fog, I heard Blackwood's voice, sharp and commanding. "Find them! Don't let them escape!" The command was issued with such authority that it felt like an iron fist coming down, squeezing the air from the very space around us. But the smoke was our ally, blurring our movements, masking our escape. I could hear the shuffling of feet, the frantic calls from Blackwood's men. They were closing in, but we were faster. We slipped through the smoke like shadows, moving carefully, methodically, toward the edge of the cliff. Edmund's grip on my arm was firm, guiding me, urging me forward. The sounds of the falls were deafening now, but there was a rhythm to it. We were nearly at the precipice. Edmund motioned for me to stay quiet, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The smoke was starting to thin, but there was no sign of Blackwood yet. He was still out there, his men combing the area, looking for us. But they had no idea where we had gone. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flicker of movement in the mist. It was Blackwood, emerging from the smoke, his figure dark against the swirling mist. He moved with the same predatory grace I had seen earlier, his eyes scanning the ground for any trace of us. Edmund turned to face me, his expression calm but resolute. "It's now or never," he said, and with that, he took off in a sprint, heading toward the rocks that jutted out over the falls. The plan was in motion. There was no turning back now. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest, but as we neared the edge of the cliff, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. They were close, too close. The sound of a gunshot cracked through the air and the bullet whizzed past my ear, narrowly missing its target. Edmund didn't flinch. He dove toward the edge of the cliff, grabbing onto the rocks with a skill that I couldn't quite comprehend. "Jump!" Edmund shouted, his voice firm, commanding. "Now!" Without thinking, I followed. We both leaped from the edge, the world plunging downward as the roar of the waterfall filled our ears. Time seemed to stretch as we fell, the wind whipping past us, the danger of the fall itself becoming more real with each passing second. I could hear Blackwood shout, faint, distant, as if coming from another world entirely, as we plummeted into the mist below, and then the impact came. The water hit me like a wall, cold and powerful. I felt the rush of it pulling me down, dragging me under. But Edmund's strong hands gripped me, pulling me toward the surface. The world around us became a blur of water and mist as we fought to stay afloat, the cascade of the falls deafening in our ears. We swam toward the shore, struggling against the current, but there was a strange sense of clarity in Edmund's eyes as he pulled me toward the safety of the rocks. We had made it. We had escaped, for now. But Blackwood's words echoed in my mind, his promise that this wasn't over. The battle may have been won, but the war was far from finished. And as we pulled ourselves onto the shore, drenched and exhausted, I knew that the true final battle had only just begun. Chapter 10. The Price of Justice. The cold, rushing waters of the Reichenbach Falls were still fresh in my mind as I stood there on the rocky shore, trying to catch my breath. My lungs burned from the cold, from the effort of swimming against the fierce current that had almost claimed us both. Edmund, soaked and shivering, was beside me, his face pale but determined. His grip on my arm was firm, as though the very touch of someone else kept him grounded, kept him from being swallowed up by the chaos that had surrounded us. We had made it out alive, barely, but the danger wasn't over. not by a long shot. Blackwood had been right behind us when we made our jump, but we had managed to escape him for now. I could still hear the faint echoes of his voice in the distance, shouting orders, his fury unmistakable even over the roar of the falls. But even as I stood there, drenched and shivering, I knew something darker loomed on the horizon. Blackwood wasn't going to stop. He never would. We had plunged into his world, into the very heart of the game he had been playing, and there would be no easy way out. There would be no peaceful resolution. As we made our way through the dark, damp forest, surrounding the falls, Edmund was silent. His thoughts were clearly miles away, and his face, usually so composed, was etched with an expression I had never seen before. A deep, wearied sorrow, as though the weight of the last few months, the fight with Blackwood, had finally taken its toll. The physical exhaustion was evident, but it was the emotional exhaustion that worried me more. "Edmund," I said, my voice tentative, "what now? What happens next?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the path ahead, his every step purposeful, but I could see the strain beneath his movements. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice low, almost distant. "We keep moving," he said simply. "We can't stay here. Not now. Not yet." I didn't question him. Not now. There was a quiet understanding between us, a bond forged through everything we had faced. Edmund was a man of action, and the decisions he made were always focused on survival, on doing whatever it took to protect those around him. But there was something different in his voice this time, something that made me pause. As we continued our trek through the woods, the reality of what had happened began to settle in. The battle at the falls, the near-death experience, those were the immediate dangers. But the true cost of what we had just done, of what we had just survived, hadn't fully revealed itself. Edmund's obsession with Blackwood had been consuming him for months, and as much as I had followed him, as much as I had supported him, I couldn't ignore the fact that our lives had been torn apart by this chase. And now, as we moved further into the Swiss wilderness, it seemed like the chase was only beginning. We made our way to a small, isolated cabin deep in the woods, a place Edmund had clearly mapped out as a temporary refuge. It was humble, far from the civilization we had left behind, but it was a safe haven, at least for the moment. The fire crackled softly in the hearth as we sat in silence, our damp clothes slowly drying by the warmth. It was here, in the stillness of the cabin, that Edmund finally spoke again, though this time his words carried a heavy burden. "I didn't want this," he began, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't want any of this. I never wanted to drag you into it, Watson. But it's too late. I've already pulled you into the heart of it all, and I'm not sure how to get us out." I stared at him, my mind spinning with questions. I had always known that Edmund had his demons, that there was something he was running from, something that had driven him to pursue Blackwood so relentlessly. But to hear him say it, to hear him finally admit to the toll it had taken on both of us, was something I hadn't been prepared for. "You don't have to do this alone," I said, my voice firm, my conviction unwavering. "We've been through this together, Edmund. I'm not leaving you now." He met my gaze, his expression softening but only slightly. There was a deep sadness in his eyes, a sadness that had been growing since we first started down this path. The truth, the reality of what we had faced, was beginning to hit him harder than I had imagined. "Do you understand what's at stake here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you understand what I've sacrificed in this pursuit? I've lost everything. My reputation, my career, my peace of mind. All for the chance to stop Blackwood, to bring him down, to stop his empire from consuming everything." I nodded, not needing to say anything more. I understood. I understood all too well the price of justice, the cost of fighting a battle so enormous that it threatened to devour everything in its path. But even as I understood, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that settled in my chest. The truth was that we had been fighting against something far bigger than either of us had ever realized. Blackwood wasn't just an enemy to be defeated. He was a force, a system, and even if we managed to bring him down, there would be others waiting to take his place. There would always be someone else who craved the power that Blackwood had built. "I didn't choose this, Watson," Edmund said, his eyes searching mine for any sign of understanding. "But now that I've started, I can't stop. I have to see this through to the end. I can't let Blackwood destroy everything. But the price has been too high." The words hung in the air between us, thick with unspoken truths. I could see the toll the pursuit of justice had taken on Edmund, the weight of it all pressing down on him. His obsession with Blackwood had taken him to the brink of destruction, and I wondered if, in the end, it would cost him more than he was willing to pay. "And what about you?" I asked quietly. "What about your own life? Your own happiness? Is it worth it, Edmund?" He didn't answer right away. He simply stared into the fire, lost in thought. The question had clearly struck a chord with him, and I knew it wasn't something he had been willing to confront until now. The pursuit of Blackwood had consumed him, and in the process, he had forgotten everything else. Forgotten his own well-being, his own peace. "I don't know anymore," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of exhaustion that I had never heard before. "I thought I was doing the right thing. But now I'm not sure if there's anything left worth saving." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. The weight of his words settled into the cabin, and I could feel the heaviness in the air, the cost of everything we had fought for, the price of the justice we had sought. It was clear that Edmund was at a crossroads, torn between his obsession with Blackwood and the life he had once known. I knew then that the road ahead would not be easy. The battle was far from over, and the consequences of what we had done would follow us for the rest of our lives. But as we sat there in the dim light of the cabin, I made a silent vow. Whatever it took, I would stand by Edmund. We would face this together, even if the price was more than we could bear. The storm outside was intensifying, the wind howling through the trees as the night deepened. But in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, the fight was far from over, and we would continue to fight, no matter the cost, no matter the price of justice. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.